This story is easily the biggest academic scandal of 2026 by far. And I did all my research for it. I wrote a whole article titled Cambridge Professor Engaged in Rampant Plagiarism and Pattern of Deception. And before I got a chance to publish that 2 or 3 days ago, the subject of the story, Dr. Jason Arday, killed himself. So, trigger warning, we're going to be talking about self harm in this video and how we got to that point and who deserves the blame. Because basically, what happened is this sociology professor, Dr. Jason Arday, was exposed as a massive fraud and then was investigated by Cambridge and then resigned from Cambridge and then killed himself in disgrace. And it's very, very sad. So, I'm not going to be talking about it with any like glibness or snarkiness, but I do think it deserves honest and blunt reporting. So, that's what I'm going to try to do in this video is just lay out the facts of how we got to this point. We're going to start at the very beginning of his origin story in that he grew up in South London to Ghanaian immigrant parents. And at age 3, he was diagnosed with autism and global development delay that made him mute. So that's a big part of his backstory is that he claimed thousands of times that he was mute. And he was so nonverbal that he didn't even speak his first word until the age of 11 after thousands of hours of speech therapy.
I always felt it was a privilege to have a period of 11 years where maybe I couldn't speak and I couldn't converse in a way that everyone else could because it allowed me to see things in a different way.
This speech therapy claim is the first part of his story that can't be independently verified. He says that the NHS provided him with 3 hours of speech therapy a day, 6 days a week, so that would be 18 hours every week. And that is an unprecedented level of treatment, far beyond anything ever provided by the NHS. But what's even worse is that as this story was unfolding, several of his primary school classmates came forward and claimed on record that he was chatting all the time and that his whole story about being a mute was fake.
Jason Arday, you know. Man, he's moving wild. Listen, I knew it was a joke thing and I knew it was fraud from man said he was a mute. What do you mean, bro? I went to school with you, bro. I was in primary school with you. You and my brethren Nibs, class clowns, chatty patty all the time, bro. What do you mean you was a mute? Listen, I knew it was a joke thing, you get me? The Ardays. This is what we used to call them, the Ardays. That man used to be like Michael Jackson and that. The mum, the dad, and his brother Joseph. They all had mini afros. All of them, bro. When I saw him in the picture and I saw long dreads look like extension tats, I was thinking, who's this? But yeah, bro. It's bait. You should have known it was going to be peak for you, bro. You should have known they were going to dig up. No one don't want to see you in that position. Joke, man. This got us looking mad now. Got us looking mad.
A few days later, someone else came forward named Magnus Akunge, who's a former professional football player and captain of Colchester United. And he told The Guardian on record that, quote, I don't remember too much about him, but I certainly recollect him being able to speak. And then when The Guardian kept investigating, they found 2 more former classmates who recalled him being able to speak as a child, and one of them remembered him joking and singing at school. And so despite claims that he was unable to read or write, he also claimed he was illiterate until he was the age of 18. Jason Arday nevertheless obtained a general certificate of secondary education, meaning he graduated from high school. And usually, in order to graduate from high school, you need to be able to read or write. When he learned to read and write at the age of 18, he went off to do an undergrad degree. And then in 2011, he got a master's degree. And in 2013, another master's degree. And then in 2015, he graduated with a PhD in education from Liverpool John Moores University, which is not a very good school. They're ranked about number 75 in the UK. And then in 2017, he became a lecturer at the University of Roehampton. And in 2018, he published his very first academic paper. In 2019, he started bouncing around schools a little bit. So he worked at the University of Warwick, and then Durham University, and then the University of Glasgow. And finally, in March 2023, at age 37, he became a full professor of sociology of education at the University of Cambridge and was widely celebrated as the youngest Black person ever appointed to hold a Cambridge professorship. In other words, he went from publishing his very first academic paper in 2018 to holding the highest rank at Cambridge just 5 years later, which is unheard of. Nobody rises that quickly, but Dr. Jason Arday did. As he rose through academia, he left a trail of lies behind him. So just lie after lie after lie. And we're going to walk through those one by one. So the first one is in 2022 in an interview with the University of Bath. He claimed he played professional football or soccer and professional snooker at age 10, which was 1 year before he could even utter a single word, allegedly. And so he told the University of Bath in an interview, quote, as a child, I was fortunate to play football well, so I was in the academy system and then played professionally. I also took up snooker when I was 10 and joined a professional tour. Except there's no record of any of this. In fact, his only recorded snooker match in 2002, it was amateur, not professional, and he lost 4-0. And there's no football database that contains any record of him playing professional football. And his memoir doesn't mention professional football, playing in an academy and playing professionally. There's no contract, there's no appearances, there's nothing. And that's not even the only lies he told about his athletic accomplishment. One of the main ones is that he claimed to have run 600 miles in 6 days for charity, which would be 50 miles short of the world record. And even that world record was accomplished on a flat circuit with a large support team and medical staff on standby. And what makes this lie even worse is that Jason Arday claimed he ran this 600 miles in 6 days on a broken leg while having seizures. And this was proven to not be true after all these journalists looked into it. And so a bunch of places where this claim was documented changed or retracted the claim. For example, Southampton Solent University, which awarded him an honorary degree in 2013, completely removed the reference to running 600 miles from their website. And another university, Anglia Ruskin University, which also awarded him a doctoral degree, on their website, they changed the reference to 600 miles in 6 days to 600 miles in 12 days after people started looking into this. So obviously he didn't play professional soccer or snooker, and it's pretty clear he didn't run 600 miles in 6 days on a broken leg while having seizures. In October 2022, Jason Arday described obtaining a master's degree in psychodynamic practice at Birkbeck University of London and becoming a qualified counselor, but this degree is not listed on his Cambridge faculty page and there's no proof it exists. So he faked a master's degree for some reason, even though he had 2 other ones. And he also claims repeatedly that he has barely slept over the last 15 years, claiming to sleep an average of 2 hours per night. Which nobody can fact check, but obviously it's not really plausible that he sleeps an average of 2 hours per night. Arday claims to have had to relearn the contents of his dissertation before defending it after losing his memory following the removal of a brain tumor. Except sometimes it's one brain tumor, sometimes it's multiple brain tumors, or when the Atlantic looked into this, they found that he also claimed to have had testicular cancer, which he then scrubbed from his memoir. And despite thousands of journalists looking into these claims, nobody's been able to find any hospital names, surgeons, operating details, medical imaging, visitor counts. Like nobody who ever visited him in the hospital has been able to verify this. And overall, there's been no third party confirmation. Arday claims that one of his formative memories in childhood was watching Nelson Mandela being released from prison, and he found that very inspirational. Except Arday was 4 years old at the time, so 4-year-olds don't really grasp the political implications of apartheid South Africa. Arday claims to have been a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and that university was forced to put out a statement saying that is not true. He also claims to have been a visiting professor at Ohio State University, who in turn says they have no record of this. He claims to have been a visiting professor at the University of Glasgow, who in turn put out a statement saying he has never held a visiting professorship here. He also claims to have been a visiting professor at Durham University, who stated that he never held such a position. So that's 4 universities that dispute his claims that he worked there. Jason Arday claims to have experienced locked-in syndrome for several months after being hit by a car, and doctors advised that his family should turn off his life support machine. But right before they pulled the plug, he awakened miraculously. He also claims to have raised more than $8 million for over 70 charities, and several of those charities have come out and refuted that claim. I'm not going to list all the charity claims, but one of them is Water Aid. Jason Arday claimed to work in South America providing water relief, but Water Aid, the charity, was forced to come out and say, no, we don't even operate in South America and we don't send people there. Arday claims he was part of the famous 7 Up documentary in the UK that follows children through their childhood, and his date of birth makes this impossible because he was born about 20 years after that documentary came out. His defense after being called out on this was that he participated in a cultural program in his community that was kind of like the documentary.
So I just turned 18 when I learned to read and write. And I was part of a program actually, which it doesn't really exist anymore, but it was called 7 Up at the time. And 7 Up is basically when they follow you over the duration of your life. So they follow you at kind of 7, 14, 21. And I was pulled up.
Arday claims he authored a book called Being Young, Black, and Male, published by Palgrave Publishing, but this book was never published. In 2021, he claimed he received funding from Mind Mental Health, claiming his research was, quote, supported by Mind. They confirmed to the Times of London that they have, quote, no record of any research we funded or commissioned relating to this. Jason Arday was involved in several Jussie Smollett-style hate crime hoaxes, including an open letter he sent to the government in 2025 where he claimed he had been physically assaulted, spat on, had sexual assault and death threats being made to him and his family, bananas and bullets being sent to him in the mail, and corrosive substances, acid, and mutilated animals sent to his family home. He took no photographs of the bullet, the banana, the acid, or the pig's head, and did not choose to keep them. Regarding the pig's head that was sent to his family home in a large cardboard box, he claimed he reported this to the police and that the police checked with butchers in all of London and asked them if they had sold a pig. And eventually they found one that sold a whole pig on that very same morning that the head was left outside his family home. When the Guardian newspaper checked those details with the local butchers that Arday had named, they said that no police officer had come to ask them about a pig, and when asked if they were sure, the butcher said, that's the kind of thing we would remember. When the details that Arday gave about the pig's head investigation were checked by London's Metropolitan Police, the Guardian newspaper was told that they were categorically incorrect and that no investigation had taken place. Jason Arday claimed that a masked man twice entered the Cambridge faculty building and threatened him with a knife unless he resigned. Cambridge had installed CCTV, but the man did not appear on CCTV, was seen by no colleagues, and Jason Arday said his panic alarm, which he said he pressed, produced no response. He did not report the encounter to Cambridge or to the police or warn colleagues that an armed intruder was in the building. Instead, he continued working. All the crazy lies we just went over are even before we get into Jason Arday's scholarship, plagiarism, and data falsification. Now, this whole thing kicked off about 3 weeks ago when another academic named Dr. Nathan Koffness posted on Substack accusing him of plagiarism. And I'm going to play a short clip now from Dr. Nathan Koffness.
In the case of Arday, it's just copy, paste, sometimes, changing some words around. It was unusual in how blatant it was and how consistently he plagiarized in the course of his career. Why are people taking this guy seriously? Like, all he does is hug people and give them high fives.
I'm not going to walk through all instances of plagiarism because there's too many, but I'm going to put some examples on the screen of just copy pasting chunks of text. In total, they found at least 188 instances where he copy pasted text, mostly in his PhD thesis and also in 2 other journal articles. The academic misconduct is actually worse than plagiarism, though. It goes into data falsification because what Jason Arday did in a 2018 social sciences paper is he pretended to interview a focus group where he talked to like 30 or 32 subjects and he printed their transcripts in his paper, but it turns out he took those transcripts word for word from an earlier paper. So he actually claimed to conduct all these interviews and perform these focus groups, when in reality, he was just copy pasting old focus groups from someone else. Before this became a national news story in 2026, in 2023, the first person to report it was a man named Dave Harris, a retired academic who noticed puzzling similarities between a 2018 Jason Arday paper and an earlier paper. He contacted Arday directly asking for an explanation, and Arday told him, quote, "Instead of spending your time trying to dismantle racism and ableism, you have spent what I assume is hours combing through my old work looking for mistakes. Anything further from you will be considered bullying and harassment." So he says, you can't look into my plagiarism because it's racism and ableism and bullying. Dave Harris, that academic, then raised the concerns with Cambridge, and Cambridge told him that it's not within their purview to investigate because the plagiarism allegedly happened before Jason Arday had been hired at Cambridge. So that's one thing I find a lot in my hundreds of academic investigations is that universities frequently make up rules out of thin air to find reasons not to investigate or to sweep stuff under the rug. So obviously there's no rules saying we can't investigate anything that happened before we hired this person. I mean, it's pretty standard to, if you receive a complaint, even before they were hired there, like you're going back to look at that person's record because that person works for you and they're teaching children who pay thousands of dollars to go to your school. This was again swept under the rug in 2025 when the Times higher education reporter Jack Grove prepared an article on the allegations that Jason Arday had plagiarized his PhD thesis and several other articles. And to prove this, they assembled a 63-page dossier of side by side text comparison and sent it to Jason Arday to get his response. And instead of responding, what Jason Arday did is he hired the most expensive, the most vicious law firm in the world, Carter Ruck. And what they did is they denied the allegations and sent a nasty letter to the reporter saying that if you publish this story, we will sue you. And so that outlet killed the story because they didn't want to take the legal risk where they'd have to spend millions of dollars defending themselves, even though it was true. And then what Jason Arday did is he called the police. So Jack Grove got a call from the Metropolitan Police telling them not to contact Jason Arday again because the story they were working on was affecting Jason Arday's mental health. So it's kind of ironic that a masked man comes into Jason Arday's office with a knife earlier, threatening him with a knife, and Jason Arday doesn't call the police. But when a journalist is working on the story, he then calls the police. Jason Arday's defense throughout this whole ordeal is that he spoke to a newspaper and told them, "It's just academia. It's not like I killed anybody." And then he blamed it on his autism and said that his autism made him susceptible to mimicry. So he mimicked other people's papers because he was autistic. Who knew that was a symptom? And as this was unfolding in July 2026, Cambridge at first publicly went to bat for Arday, and they put out a statement calling it a vile campaign to undermine his credibility and basically called everyone racist. And then, as more and more lies were uncovered, a couple of weeks later, on August 5th, Cambridge changed courses and announced that due to new information, they had begun an investigation into Arday's academic qualifications. A few hours later, he resigned from Cambridge, stating that the only way to bring this chapter to an end is to step away. And then it was 1 week later, on August 13th, that he killed himself. This brings us up to speed to today, where today in London, Trafalgar Square, thousands of people showed up to mourn for Jason Arday.
While those who loved him watched and warned and were not heard. They were so vicious that they attempted, and this is how wicked.
What's happening now is that there's this huge fight online where people are trying to figure out who to blame. And lots of people are blaming Nathan Koffness, who's the guy who pointed out the plagiarism that kicked this whole thing off. And he's getting a ton of death threats now, including this one on the screen that says, "We are going to Charlie Kirk your ass." A lot of people are blaming white supremacy or the media. There are literally hundreds of articles with the exact same title, that is, "The Media Lynched Jason Arday." And I think this is lazy and misses the mark, because if you commit rampant fraud and you're called out for it, it's not really the person's fault for calling you out for it. It's your own fault. And so ultimately, I think what happened here is that the liberal establishment promoted Jason Arday beyond his capabilities and held him to a lower standard, and did not give him any scrutiny, and just clapped along because they wanted this DEI mascot to hold up to the world to prove how enlightened they are. And before he was working in academia, Jason Arday was a gym teacher. And I think that's probably where he belonged, because he's not this mega genius. He's not the smartest guy in the world. He's just like a random guy who's not that smart, who likes to help children. And he would have been a perfectly competent gym teacher, I think. But instead, the liberal establishment promoted him to the A leagues, to Cambridge, where he couldn't compete against actual geniuses. And so he had to cheat and lie in order to keep up. And that was ultimately his downfall. Jason Arday's memoir is set to come out next month. It's full of lies, and he lied that he was paid $1.4 million to write it. But it does have one prophetic line, so I'm going to give him the last word in this article. In his memoir, he writes, "What if I have completely overestimated my capabilities? What if my story ends up being a cautionary tale, like Icarus, about flying too close to the sun?